Welcome to the Live Like an Acrobat podcast. I am your host, Shenea Stiletto. My guest on today's podcast is lobbyist and advocate for survivors of sexual violence, Samantha Cadet. Welcome to the podcast, Samantha. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. You have an extensive bio and your experience is amazing. Samantha Cadet was a double major in criminal justice and international affairs and graduated from the University of Georgia, UGA, where she became very interested in courses analyzing human rights violations, especially sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. During her studies, she interned in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division, Office of International Affairs, where she helped domestic and foreign prosecutors gather evidence in advance extradition requests. During this time, she aided with many cases relating to child sexual exploitation on platforms. Upon graduation, she joined the UGA Office of Government Relations in Washington, D.C., first as a federal government relations assistant and then as the assistant director of federal relations. Within these positions, she worked closely with the director of federal relations in executing the university priorities with the federal government and served as the university's liaison with Congress, federal departments, agencies, higher education associations, and advocacy groups. After 5.5 years of lobbying for her alma mater, she joined the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network as their Director of Federal Affairs, Appropriations, and National Coalitions for RAINN. RAINN, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, is the largest anti-sexual violence organization in the nation and created and operates the National Sexual Assault Hotline. She was solely responsible for RAINN's entire federal portfolio, which included advocating for appropriations, creating legislation, and enhancing existing federal statutes to address sexual exploitation and aid survivors. During this time, she worked with Congress, federal agencies, and the White House in addressing sexual violence, sexual harassment, and child sexual abuse and exploitation. Wow. I mean, wow. I gave it my best shot. Samantha, you are like remarkable. Your experience is so amazing. And we actually met for Lobby Day for RAINN earlier, actually last year because it's 2024. Oh my God.
No, it's crazy. It's crazy where 2023 went. Oh my goodness.
It went so fast. But I was super grateful and privileged to work with you, Samantha, as a survivor myself of USA Gymnastics. Those that listen into the podcast know that I have been a survivor of USA Gymnastics for many years now, that I have worked with Congress, with senators, and with policymakers, and with several different organizations over the years in advocating for survivors and for the Olympic movement and to protect those from sexual violence within amateur sports. I'm also a big proponent of safe sport. I helped to push safe sport statutes through several years ago. And we recently, Samantha, looked at safer sport, which are amendments that have been proposed to safe sport. And for those out there listening, safe sport statute continues to go through amending or amendments for the last several years. It's not something that is static when you're dealing with policy. That's something that will continue to evolve over time and have different eyes on it. So I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to work with you recently on that too, to give my feedback in what I think safer sport should include, what's still lacking and missing with respect to safe sport, and then also to the other bills and policies that we looked at together that eventually ended up being passed and I think receiving more funding and such. Do you want to go a little bit into about what our missions were during that time together, Samantha?
Yeah, of course. And I do want to clarify, I'm currently no longer with RAINN. It was great. I spent about 2.5 years there and it was great, but I decided to make a personal decision to leave for personal reasons. But regardless, I would love to talk about some of the things I did when I was there, especially with you. So one thing was we worked on basically a piece of legislation that would enhance investigations for child sexual abuse materials. So I'd love to go into what that is. Child sexual abuse materials is just another term for child pornography. Child pornography is the legal term for it. And I just want to give a trigger warning because we are going to be talking about child sexual abuse. So trigger warning for everyone listening. So what a lot of people don't understand what child sexual abuse materials, or also known as child pornography, really is. People think it's just naked pictures of children. That's actually very hard to litigate. What it actually is children being bonded and raped and sexually abused. So that's why we want to change the definition to child sexual abuse materials, because it accurately represents that. But some of the pieces of legislation that we worked on, we wanted to go ahead and form a working group that would actually study out how many children are actually being abused in terms of child sexual abuse materials, how many children are in those photos that we can identify and locate right now, how many perpetrators are actually looking at those materials in the US, and what are the resources needed to identify and rescue the children in those images and videos. So that's one piece of legislation. We also worked on a piece of legislation to make sure law enforcement just have enough resources to investigate it. Right now, law enforcement, they're just inundated with these cases, especially with cyber tip line reports. For those of you who do not know what cyber tip line reports are, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they have a great system where you can report on if you see child sexual abuse materials online. So when you put it in a report, you actually, which is great, you actually just notify the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and law enforcement is notified of that report, and they are required by law to look into those reports. I will say that they receive tens of million reports each year. And I want to say last year it was, or excuse me, I can't say last year because we're in 2024, so it's 2022. I want to say it was over 32 million reports that they received just in 2022. So law enforcement are actually required to look into every one of those reports. So we want to make sure that they had enough resources in order to do so. So we worked on multiple pieces of legislation, especially like very specific ones too, to change federal statutes. Like I said, we want to change the term child pornography to child sexual abuse materials. Again, the word pornography means it's two consenting adults agreeing to engage in a sexual act for it to be videotaped and photographed. Putting a word child in front of it doesn't make sense. And we hear from a lot of survivors that changing the term is very important. So we want to do that. One other thing that we worked on together was ensuring that these platforms are held accountable for the materials that are actually on their platforms. You mentioned in my intro, when I worked for the US Department of Justice, I saw a lot of child sexual exploitation on platforms. I mean, Facebook, WhatsApp, Kik was another one as well, that messaging system, Twitter, it's really bad as well on that, or I should say X. However, a lot of these platforms are not held accountable. And I'll give one really quick example. Twitter had a situation where it was actually two teenage boys were coerced into providing sexually explicit photos, actually via Snapchat, to a person that they thought was a 16-year-old girl, ended up to be a middle-aged man who's a trafficker. Uh, then they were actually able to rescind that communication between them, which was good. They were able to get away from that person. But 3 years later, when the boys were 16, a compilation of those photos and a video of those photos actually were leaked onto Twitter. And unfortunately, people from their high school saw it. The boys were contemplating suicide, all these horrible things. Thankfully, one of the boys' mothers found out before it was too late. She contacted Twitter. And after multiple attempts of trying to contact them, they finally replied back saying, hey, we reviewed the materials and it doesn't violate any of our terms or policies. So they actually kept the photos for an additional 9 days. And within those 9 days, those photos received over 100, I believe it was over 170,000 views and over 2,000 retweets. And then after they went through the litigation process, because Twitter profited off of legally what's known as child pornography, Twitter was not held liable because of something called CDA 230, which protects these companies from being held liable for the content that their users put on their platforms. So we wanted to go ahead and fix CDA 230 to make sure that consumers can sue these platforms for profiting off of those materials as well. So we worked on a lot of stuff together. You were amazing. I remember you during those meetings. I mean, you just held such a command during the meetings, and so many staffers really appreciated your point of view and hearing from you. So, we loved working with you, and I hope to work in this space in the future. We're working on it. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Samantha. I really appreciate that feedback. And that's another reason of why I have you on the podcast, because it's not easy going into those spaces, obviously, like lobbying and advocating, on behalf of survivors and speaking about very difficult topics, like child pornography, and like sexual violence. And there is an etiquette kind of for being in those spaces. It's not for everyone. It's also too not for the faint of heart. Sometimes it can be very intimidating going into the office of a congressperson or a senator, and maybe sharing your story, or asking for something. And, advocacy within the circus arts industry is very, very new. Advocacy within the gymnastics space is also still incredibly new. And I'm grateful to share my stories and my experiences, to support these bills and to support, these legislation, being pushed forward. And also, too, things that are very similar to what I dealt with USA Gymnastics, where, people are able to sue companies that are deemed kind of too big to fail, like USA Gymnastics was. It took us all a very long time to get access and permissions to hold any of these big spaces accountable, the Olympic movement, the Olympic committees, and so that was us just a few years ago. And I mean, up until very, very recently, we were still having our cases and things like that too. So I have benefited tremendously from policy, tremendously. And so that's why I keep coming back, even if sometimes it's very challenging. But what I also want to do is continue to bring that energy into the circus arts space and show them what it's like to advocate on Washington, D.C. for something that you're very passionate about. It doesn't have to be something that was necessarily hurtful to you, but it can be something about your career or about the industry that you think could do well to change, that would benefit others, maybe directly or indirectly. We are ourselves within our advocacy committee, going into meetings and speaking on behalf of the circus arts industry, quite frequently now over the past few years. And so I would like to spread that message and to spread the normalization of contacting your reps, of being in these spaces, of understanding policy. Policy is not very easy. Policy language is difficult, sometimes to understand. I know sometimes I have to study it, quite a bit to understand exactly what I'm reading. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have, your vast amounts of education, that you have, Samantha, but I have gotten experience just from the last 13 years of having to be a survivor and being around folks that are willing and have been willing to educate me. But I wanted to get your perspective, Samantha, on what do you think is very important to remember when you are coming into the advocacy space, into the nonprofit sphere, or into the lobbyist position, which I like to call it. But obviously, when you're, advocating on behalf of nonprofits and certain things, there's certain terms that you cannot use, for the work that you're doing. But that's a term that I know that readily comes to most people's minds, and that lobbying is not always a bad thing. Lobbying can actually be a very, very good thing and a very, very powerful thing, which I find I get to change people's kind of ideas of what that term means too, when I speak to them, because you can be lobbying for incredibly good causes that will effectuate a lot of change. So, what do you think is important for us to understand and to know, when we're coming into these spaces that you've been in and worked in so brilliantly for so long?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one thing I always have to remind myself is we have to tell a story. Like if you have masterclass and if you can look up masterclasses on storytelling, that will really help you. Because when you tell a story, it will pull staffers in. First of all, a lot of these conversations are actually with staffers. Staffers make a lot of the decisions. They're the ones pushing the members of Congress. If you can get a member meeting, great, but staffers are the one that's doing the legwork. So that's one. Two, tell the story. And the way I tell the story is you present the problem and you make sure they understand completely what the problem is. And then you present a solution. So, for example, the problem with the Doe versus Twitter case, right? The problem was there were kids who had sexually explicit photos on Twitter. It was obviously sexually explicit. There were 13 in the photos, and Twitter didn't remove them. Oh, by the way, when they removed them, I forgot to mention this in my story. When they removed them, they actually removed them because the mother of one of the survivors knew someone that knew an HSI agent, a Homeland Security Investigation agent, and that agent contacted Twitter. So when I always tell that story, I always say, you know what? Not everyone knows HSI agents, right? So exactly. So present the story, tell what the problem is, right? So again, with Twitter, the problem was there are these sexually explicit photos that could happen to any child on Twitter, and Twitter refused to remove them. And when they were finally forced to remove it, they weren't held accountable for profiting off of child sexual abuse materials, right? I think everyone can relate to that story. Everyone can see how horrible it is and then present the solution. So for us, what we were lobbying on, the solution was basically, I don't want to say removing CDA 230, people don't like that term, but basically improving CDA 230 to allow that for survivors to be able to get justice and sue these platforms that are profiting off of the most horrendous moments of their lives, right? So that's really important storytelling, presenting the problem and presenting a solution that these members of Congress can actually put into effect. So that's one. I think also if you go into a particular member's office, if you can find something in their district or if it's a senator in their state, you can find a story in their state and you're saying, hey, this happened to your constituent. This is a problem and you can fix it. That helps a lot as well. Ultimately, you want to think that even with what we were lobbying on, you want to think that every member of Congress is passionate about it. But to be honest, not everyone's passionate about it. I know in terms of CDA 230, unfortunately, there are members of Congress that they were really influenced by the technology sector, so they weren't as passionate to do something about it. But it was when we brought in their constituents, that's when I did not see pushback. I remember there was one particular staffer, and I won't name names, one particular staffer in the state. But when I met with them independently, they were candid with me, which is good. That's another thing, build those relationships so they can be candid with you. But when I brought in survivors, like 4 survivors from their state, they did not give me any pushback during that meeting. So that's really important too. And then as the third thing is building these relationships. I've definitely had formed great relationships where if something wasn't moving, the staffer told me why. And I was like, great. As opposed to if you don't have that relationship, the staffer would just say something crazy. They won't give you the full truth of why something's not moving because, they want to protect their member. They want to do X, Y, and Z. But and then I have to do more digging and all this stuff. But so you have to form a great relationship for the staffers to say, hey, this is not moving because of this stupid thing that has nothing to do with it because of these politics. And then maybe I can actually influence those politics, or maybe I have to say, okay, well, we have to wait to do X, Y, and Z because I can't influence, like, I don't know, the majority leader being pissed at this particular member. That's the member to member thing. So I can't do anything about it. So, so it's always have those really great relationship with those staffers for them to really like give you the lowdown and to be honest with you and frank. Because I've definitely had staffers tell me, you know what, again, CDA 230. I've had staffers tell me, you know what, like my caucus is not down for CDA 230 reform. They're just not. Like if you want to see something move, you need to contact so and so and so and so and really put pressure on them. I'm like, great, I have a game plan. So
Those are like great strategies. What do you think is the most important thing in creating those relationships with those staffers? How do you do that without seeming pushy or overzealous or annoying them or, and then turning them off essentially to your cause when you were trying to get them more invested in your cause? What are the things to do and to kind of not do?
Oh, great question. I think that's always a balancing act. One thing, when I go to staffers, it's not always about my subject matter. Sometimes it's just like, hey, I just want to get to know you, especially if it's a staffer I don't know and they're new. I'll do coffee with them. And it's honestly generally to get to know them. And these staffers are people too. They're great. They're our age. So that's one thing, just building a relationship with them as a person, I've had like I built actually, there was one particular staffer that comes to mind. I had maybe a 2-hour conversation with him before I even got to my stuff and our priorities. And because of that, who'd contact me saying, hey, so my roommate wants to learn more about your work. Can you meet with her? We actually built a friendship. And one thing is to actually build a relationship with them to show like, hey, we're working together. It's not as if you're doing me favors. There will be times where they do me favors for sure. Then there will be times where I do them favors. But more, and when I say do them favors, I mean more so like tweet out that their member did such a great job, or if they want help talking to another office. For example, if a Republican needs help convincing a Democrat to be on their bill, I can talk to the Democrats to see, hey, do you want to be on this bill? And I can present it to them because they might listen to me more than the actual staffer, because of those political dynamics. So making sure that we have that relationship and making sure that they feel like we're working together as opposed to them just doing me a favor, passing this piece of legislation that will actually help everyone. I will say also sometimes you have to be annoying, and and I've definitely like you have to be. I've definitely been annoying, and it got things done. I was like, oh, great.
That worked too.
It does. You know, I here's one example. For one of the funding streams for RAINN, it's more so a funding stream to fund the hotline. RAINN has a national sexual assault hotline. This one staffer, she's great, but reauthorizing that just wasn't her priority at the time. So I had to be a little annoying. Like every meeting I had with her, I mentioned like, hey, remember like this hotline, that's one of the only national hotlines that's not receiving congressional support. We need it because there's a lot of people contacting the hotline. We want to reduce wait times and whatnot. And after a while of me, and I can tell she was getting a little annoyed because every meeting I'd mention it. But we were able to reauthorize it because I kept on reminding her. And she's like, oh, right, okay. And we were able to get in a bill and it was reauthorized. So sometimes being annoying, it's okay.
I think I take that first. In the annoying part, from my experience too, I've seen that can go pretty far in kind of like agitating and waking people up.
Mhm.
Because I always say, if you don't do it, somebody else will. If you're too timid around the conversation that you're fighting for, somebody will come right on in and just surpass you and get what they want without being worried about, how they look or if they're annoying or if they're doing too much. But it does get a little bit worrisome. Like I said, when you don't want to be rejected by an office, when you don't want them to not want to respond to your request or to take another look at what you're asking for. And again, with people that aren't very familiar in these spaces, I know that feeling timid is their biggest default in wanting, like, we don't want to offend anyone and we don't want to ask for too much, and we want to show that we're going to support them more than we need them to support us. And so I was wondering, what do you think about that, Samantha, and in kind of getting over that feeling of being too timid, or also too discussing with staffers topics and issues that they really don't know very much about without seeming patronizing or without seeming like you're taking up all the air in the room, even though they really tell you that they want to be super informed about a
Mhm.
specific topic, but you don't usually have a lot of time in discussing with staffers either. You get sometimes 30 minutes if you're lucky. Sometimes they don't even switch on their cameras. You don't even see their faces during these conversations. So it's like you're speaking to yourself, but somebody very important is there.
Mhm.
And sometimes you don't get a follow up meeting for several months, and a lot can happen in a few months.
Oh, so true. So first off, in terms of, I completely understand, especially in this virtual world. Sometimes you're in a meeting, they don't have their camera on because they're doing a million other things. Like, oh, what's happening? I say one, the fact that you have the meeting and you can take and you're doing your due diligence, being a lobbyist can be really hard because sometimes with all your efforts, something doesn't come to fruition. But at the end of the day, you're one step closer. With every Congress, you're one step closer. There are some bills that take years to pass, like with the bill on CDA 230 reform. That was since 2020 that we've been trying to actually push to pass that bill. But each Congress, honestly, we're one step closer, which is great. It could be discouraging sometimes, but seeing the steps, like my goals, the way I measure goals is not only passing a piece of legislation, but it's also getting 50 members on co-sponsored on it, as opposed to the 20 we got last Congress, getting it to pass one chamber, getting it to pass a committee. So I think also like remembering that to have smaller goals and ultimately, the ultimate goal is to pass it, but to have smaller goals is great. In terms of getting over being timid, that can be so difficult. I know you don't want to rock the boat, but I will say you have to rock the boat sometimes, like you just do. I remember when I worked at RAINN, it was one of the bills, part of the Safe Childhood Act that we worked on. It was going to pass the Senate, but it was one member just blocking it for no reason.
Mm.
None. This
Mm.
member, he is historically, this was in the Senate, he's historically like an obstructionist, he just holds bills for no reason. He didn't give any reason to hold it. And I know for me, I will say I was trying to be the educator, because I consider lobbyists as educators. I always say, thank God there's lobbyists, because members don't know everything. Staffers don't know everything. We're just all people. So I remember trying to educate them. I offered to show them the DOJ undercover system. I would work with the National Criminal Justice Training Center, and they train officers on this DOJ undercover system that you can actually see like just different basically you can see the pedophiles trading on peer-to-peer networks. And this is public peer-to-peer networks. They're not hiding behind VPNs or encrypted messages. So you can see how many are trading in a particular state, but also in a particular district. You can like go and sharpen it to like a city. So I offered the member to like look at the system to see how many pedophiles are publicly sharing on in their state, and law enforcement is not able to get them because of lack of resources. I told them the number that's they're sharing all this stuff. And it was to the point where I will say I was being too nice, because it took a couple of months and they still didn't respond. So then I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to get survivors in their state to email this member. And after 4 days of that, they lifted their hold, So with that and it's about that constituent base. So,
And
um,
constituents are the members in that representative's district. So it's constituents are the people that they represent. So it's your representative. For those that are maybe unfamiliar with these terms that we are using right now, the constituents are you voted them into office. If you vote, which I hope that you do. This is a big election year, also too. By the way, for those listening in, I speak a lot about that, Samantha, in encouraging our industry to vote, because you want to vote and get people in there that support art policy, that support policy that could be geared towards circus, or geared towards the amateur athletic movements, or geared towards protecting survivors. And you want to know, have they met with Samantha Cadet? Like, do they know the issues properly? And we'll call you, and we'll call Samantha if they haven't.
That's funny. No, exactly. No, thank you so much for clarifying that. And in terms of constituents, because you guys were all a constituent of someone, and so important. They need our vote, especially House members. I mean, they are up for reelection every 2 years. They need the constituents, and yeah, like, so with that situation, we had to throw an elbow, and I'm sure they were annoyed, but at the end of the day, we needed to we try to educate them, and they were just being really stubborn, so we threw an elbow. And I think that's fine. There's going to be times in your lobbying career or just in advocacy work, where you have to throw an elbow. Like you said, we might have a 30-minute meeting. I think just figuring out your high points and figuring out your story, try to tell your story within the first like 10 minutes, if that, try to tell you the problem and how they can be a solution to the problem. And if they have a lot of questions, great. If not, it's okay. There might be other staffers in that office that, are better suited to like take your concerns. But also, I mean, there's 100 senators and 435 members of Congress, or excuse me, 435 House members. So there's other offices you'll find that are interested in helping you as well. So don't be discouraged when one office isn't as vocal or interested in your issue area, because I even experienced that within my line of work. When you think everyone would be concerned about sexual violence, especially against children, But honestly, there were member offices that were not as loud about it. So
which is again, yeah, like fascinating to me. And again, like we know, there's a lot of different influences around why sometimes they're not interested in these very, very crucial and important topics. And also too, I think why, things kind of like languish, and then why that change happens like slower on these very difficult topics. People ask me that all the time. How did these crazy, egregious things go on for so long? And I can't believe that, so many people know about this and they don't, take the initiative and stop this right away. And, how could anyone not support that or vote it down, or, and like we know, there's many different influences around, in politics that will, have representatives or senators or, not push for those things. And that can be very unfortunate. It can be depressing. Like I said, being in this space now for nearly 13 years, we've had a lot of lows, within my journey, but we've also had a lot of wins. And those wins, when they are wins, are brilliant and effectuate a lot of change and change a lot of people's lives for, years and years and years to come. I like what you're mentioning too, Samantha, and we are getting close to the end. We're going to speak for just a few more minutes here. And thank you so, so much for breaking down these very unique and difficult processes that many people just don't go into these spaces a lot. And so, again, I would like to demystify them. I want to give everybody the confidence to contact their reps, to contact their senators, get their meetings on their own, and come with the issues that are important to you within the gymnastics space or within the circus industry, and get them on their radar. Don't you think that's very important too, Samantha? Even if you don't have this solution, I always say, yes, but even if you're the first person that they've ever heard discuss the circus arts, you're finally the first person that's ever discussed the circus arts with them. And it's the senator's office. That's amazing.
no, I completely agree. Always, like you said, even if you don't have a solution, always just let them know about the problem, because you never know. Sometimes, I mean, I've definitely had it where I talked to a member of Congress about a problem and they were very interested in it. And they even said, oh, I have family members that experienced the same thing. And you guys can work on a problem together, which is always so great. Or excuse me, on a
Oh,
solution together, which is always so great. So yes.
yeah, you never know like what could come out of you presenting those issues to them down the road. I mean, it might not even be immediate, but if it's finally swirling around, it could eventually get to the right door and get to the right person that, can handle that. And we've had that too in different respects where they'll say, this office is really behind that issue. We could really support you on that. It'd be super helpful. And they will be able to be super helpful for you. And it's something that we never could have thought of on our own. And they found a way to connect with that particular circus arts issue in a way that, again, we could never have thought of on our own. Again, because that's not our job. And you don't have to do their job for them all the time, even though we are consistently trying to bring solutions that we think will be viable, and seeing, again, how we can, put those things into motion and have them come to fruition. And it's a constant gamble, and it's, an evolution and a lot of work. I wanted to ask you, Samantha, in leaving us today, what do you think is most valuable to remember in being in a position like yours and being in the dynamics of lobbying, of advocating, of being in these spaces where you are asking for help, where you are trying to define policy, where you are pushing for legislation? What is the most important thing to remember, and how to hold yourself, and then on kind of the road and the steps that it takes to process these journeys? And I guess maybe, yeah, kind of the complexity of them, but how they can become less complex for someone who has not ever ventured into this space, but very much wants to.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is that the worst people can say is no. That's the worst, right? Like you need to present it. You have no idea what's going to happen, you know. Don't be timid, present it. Don't worry as much about annoying people. Just, see if you can gauge their interest within the first couple of meetings. And that there's so many offices, there's so many members of Congress. You'll find people that are interested in this. You'll find people that are concerned about what you're concerned about. Um, and think of it as more so you guys are working together for a solution on something. And these staffers don't know everything. These staffers are, I mean, if I become a staffer, I won't know everything. These staffers are just people like you and I. So just know that you'll be coming in with new information. And again, I always look at lobbyists. I always say thank God for lobbyists, because some members of Congress, there are members of Congress that don't really know about a particular subject matter. And thank God there's lobbyists that come in and say, hey, this is the situation. I mean, there have been times where a member of Congress tries to do a bill that will help survivors, or back when I was at UJ, they'll try to do a bill that will help students in terms of financial aid. And I look at the bill, I'm like, this is going to make things 10 times worse, So I always say, thank God for lobbyists, because sometimes people have the best of intentions and they just don't know how to execute it. So, like, know that your voice really does matter. Your experiences really do matter. And you talking to members of Congress and staffers about your experience really will make a difference. And to be patient to see that difference as well. So.
That is so brilliant. And just one more question. Is there a space, or is there an opportunity where if people want to speak to lobbyists, and, and get more information, or, discuss something with a lobbyist, is there any kind of like online network that supports that? It, again, in trying to demystify, I'm speaking to a lobbyist right now. I've had access to you. I'm very grateful for that. But not everyone feels like they have immediate access to a lobbyist to pick their brain, or to ask them about things that are challenging or that they don't understand. If there is no space like that, I understand. But is there anything like that that you could suggest?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know of a space like that, but I do suggest, say, for example, if you're interested in the anti-sexual violence realm and you know different nonprofits, if you look on the website for the government relations office, there's more than likely they may have a government relations office, and to reach out to them. Like, I know for me, I was always so amenable to like meeting with people who are interested in the space, and they want to see how they could help. And I was interested when I was a university lobbyist, and then as a lobbyist, as a former lobbyist for RAINN. So if you are interested in a particular subject matter and you know an organization or a nonprofit that really advocates or more so works in that subject matter, see if they're doing anything in the federal realm, and contact their people. So I always suggest that. It does. And again, the worst people can say is no. So contact, see if they want to do coffee or do a virtual meeting, and then move from there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Samantha. I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast. And the Live Like an Acrobat podcast is also available on Circus Talk, the inclusive, independent, and international online network for the circus industry. Circus Talk's mission is to create a level playing field for this industry and democratize access to information. Thank you again, Samantha. You're so, so brilliant. I appreciate you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.